kind introduction. It's really a very great pleasure to be here today, and I especially am thankful to the organizers of this seminar on the history of ideas for inviting me here to speak about evolution. It's always nice to be invited to speak, especially in a series of talks which one has attended oneself as part of the audience and greatly enjoyed. But to be invited to speak about evolution is particularly pleasing for the following reason. The subject which I work in, evolutionary biology, is extremely underrepresented in India. It's practically non-existent. And at the same time, I think it should be perhaps having more visibility and should be getting more importance than it has in this country. And so I am very happy to have a chance to try to make my argument for why I think this is a very important subject and one which really does not deserve the state of neglect it is in. And I hope that to some extent in this talk I will be able to convince you, at least in part, that there are a lot of dimensions to evolutionary biology as a subject, or evolution as a concept. To sort of set the mood for the talk, I would actually like to begin by quoting from something I wrote a couple of years ago. I wrote a review of a book by Michael Rose called Darwin's Spectre: Evolutionary Biology in the Modern World, and this appeared in the Journal of Genetics in 2000. And I think the first paragraph of that book review really sets the tone for the rest of the talk. And I had written at that time, "It is easy to underestimate the importance of Darwin's intellectual legacy. Most of us, especially in India, first encounter Darwin in secondary school, not as the architect of one of the greatest intellectual revolutions in the history of humankind, but as one among many biologists whose contribution is summed up in three trite phrases: overproduction of offspring, struggle for existence, and survival of the fittest." Unfortunately, this state of affairs persists long after secondary school has become a memory far more pleasant than the experience was at that time. Most people, including most biology students in India, would probably think you were being facetious if you told them that Darwin was among the greatest thinkers the world has ever produced, and moreover one whose thinking has indelibly changed not only the intellectual but also the practical world. In a class of 14 bright postgraduate students that I taught a few years ago, 13 felt that evolutionary biology had no practical applications. I should add here that the sole dissenter was my own PhD student who was doing a PhD in evolutionary biology. So this in some sense sums up the situation. On the one hand, you have one of the greatest intellectual revolutions of mankind, and on the other hand, in India, you have biology sort of tagged on to, evolution tagged on to biology curricula almost as an afterthought. Could I have the next? So what I would like to do in this talk is really talk a little bit about why I think evolution is special as a scientific idea, and I mean special in a particular sense. This will come clear as I go along. Of course, most major scientific ideas are very special in their own way, but evolution, as I said, has some dimensions to it that give it some features of uniqueness. And then I would like to present what is one view on the place of evolution in the history of scientific ideas. And by scientific ideas here, of course, I'm going to restrict myself largely to placing the idea of evolution and ultimately modern evolutionary biology in the context of European thought over the past 1,000 years or so, because most scientific ideas are really restricted in some sense to thought during that era in that continent. And finally, I would like to come to some aspects of the importance of evolution. I will talk about what exactly we mean by evolutionary biology today and try to give you some feel for the domain of evolutionary biology and the kinds of issues that are addressed in evolution, and then come to the importance of evolution not only for academic biology but even beyond academic biology. It is also somewhat strange actually for me to give a talk of this kind where I am not really talking about my own experiments. And so usually when we talk about our experiments towards the end, we acknowledge all the students and other people in the lab who did all the work. In this case, next slide please, I would like to acknowledge upfront a number of people whose thoughts have been very helpful to me in shaping my own views on evolution. Some of these people I have known in person, some of them I have listened to, some of the others I have read. And for this talk, basically I do not make any claim to originality except for maybe the design of a few heuristic graphics about the nature of evolution. And so I'm going to be leaning quite heavily on various ideas and notions and things that many of these people have put forth. Michael Rose, the author of Darwin's Spectra and an outstanding experimental evolutionary biologist. James Burrow, who wrote a very beautiful introduction to a penguin edition of The Origin of Species by Darwin. Michael Ruse, the philosopher of biology, who has written many books on Darwinism from the philosopher's point of view. Stephen Jay Gould, who recently passed away, who has written all kinds of things about various aspects of evolution. Ernst Mayr, a systematist and philosopher, who has written a lot about the philosophy of evolutionary biology. I've got some interesting information from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And for the broader implications of evolution beyond academic biology, there is a very nice white paper supported by the National Science Foundation, US, and many evolutionary societies called Evolution, Science and Society, which is very informative. And finally, my PhD supervisor, John Thompson, who is not only an extremely good field evolutionary biologist, but also a very well-known Darwin scholar in his own right. And as I said, much of what I have to say is culled from what I have read and what I have learned and discussed with many of these people. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is the claim often made that evolution is special as a scientific idea? One of the things is perhaps that evolution addresses issues that are very close to us in many ways. They are close to us in terms of the subject matter. They are close to us because they address issues of genealogy. And issues of genealogy in some sense are always very, very interesting to most of us. It's in some sense part of human nature. And in that sense, evolution, at least some aspects of evolution, perhaps come close to the sort of fundamental issues of who we are. And in that sense, evolution is a little bit different from most other areas of biology in coming this close to sort of key questions about our identity. It is special because of its scope to some extent in terms of its explanatory power when applied to the living world. An evolutionary point of view, again, comes close to us, gives us interesting insights into many aspects of human behavior. And in fact, it is arguable and has been somewhat controversial, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about this towards the end, but we ignore an evolutionary point of view while trying to understand human behavior, in my opinion, only at our peril. Which is not to say that every evolutionary speculation about human behavior is necessarily right. Many of them are not. But I think to ignore an evolutionary perspective in thinking about human behavior, which is essentially what classical psychology did, is potentially not a very, very good idea. Okay, this basically has to do with the various applications of evolution. Evolution, in fact, ramifies into practically every area in biology, and in fact I will argue at some point in this talk that evolution or biology today is, in a broad sense, evolution. Evolution is not just a discipline of biology, it cuts across every discipline of biology, and we'll come to that again in some detail. And finally, this is an interesting point, that evolution poses a major challenge to certain theologies. And the reason I stress the major is that many other scientific discoveries, like the Earth not being the center of the solar system, etc., have also posed a challenge to certain theologies. But the challenge has not really been very major, and the theologians were able to sort of get around the challenge and accommodate this within their worldview without really having to drop any particular aspects of their theology. And in this respect, evolution has actually posed a very, very major challenge to certain theologies. And the consequence of this has been that evolution is perhaps unique among scientific ideas, that even within the last 100 years, which we think of as being a fairly enlightened and rational period of time, there have been movements trying to ban the teaching of evolution as recently as a decade or so ago. There have been instances where entire cohorts of evolutionary biologists have been exiled and executed because they were evolutionary biologists, not because they happened to be Jewish scientists or they belonged to some particular group, but because they were evolutionary biologists and believed in Darwinism. And in these respects also evolution has been a little bit unique among major scientific ideas, in that its social and political ramifications have been fairly dramatic and in some cases fairly horrific. I will argue a little bit later into the talk that these ramifications have largely been because of the misunderstandings of evolution and the misapplications of evolution to domains where it really should not be applied, but the fact remains that evolution has had major social, political, religious consequences, and that again tends to make it a little bit unique. Next slide, please. This has in fact been very beautifully summed up by Michael Rose. This is actually the first paragraph of his book, Darwin's Spectre, and he says, "A spectre is haunting the modern world, Darwin's spectre, Darwinism. The spectre has frightened religious ministers, curdled school curricula, and left the politically correct ill at ease. Alone among modern scientific doctrines, Darwinism has upset many beyond the academy. It has had enemies on the right and the left, and some states liquidated Darwinians for their scientific beliefs. Darwin's spectre won't go away." Next slide, please. So that is one aspect of the uniqueness of Darwinian views on evolution in science. The other thing that I mentioned briefly was that in many senses I would like to argue that biology is basically evolution if you take evolution in a slightly broader sense. And more importantly, I think if you look at biological systems, there are many very unique characteristics of biological systems, their hierarchical organization, the extent of variation that you find within every hierarchical level that you look at, the emergent properties at every hierarchical level that you look at. And many of these sort of special characteristics of biological systems have been shaped by evolution. And in fact, life evolves is more than just a trivial statement. I think it's one of the characteristics of life. And this issue I will come to in some detail later on in the talk after going through a little bit of the intellectual history of evolution. But I just offer up here a few quotes to sort of exemplify this view that biology is somehow very, very important and central. Evolution is very important and central to biology. Bronowski says evolution is crucial to any discussion of biology because this and only this makes biology a different sort of subject from physics. Evolution is the study of the very dynamics of life, Dobzhansky. And this one, which I personally love, for a biologist, the alternative to thinking in evolutionary terms is not to think at all, Medawar. And the only grand theory in biology is that of evolution, Michael Rose. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me now turn to the history, and this may be a slightly simplistic view of what happened in Europe in the last 1,000 years, but one can identify, and many scholars do identify, three major upheavals that have taken place in European intellectual society after say 1000 AD. One was in the 12th and 13th centuries, the Europeans rediscovered, thanks to the Arabs, a very large body of knowledge, some of it coming from Asia and also some of it coming from Europe itself, and that is the Greek knowledge. So there was this rediscovery of sort of Greek philosophy, Greek natural science, Aristotle's writings, etc., which came back to Europe in the 12th and 13th century from the Arabs. The next was in some sense, and there is some element of cause and effect in all of these running through. Next is in some sense the revolution in the physical sciences in the 16th and 17th centuries, where you have the work of Galileo, and then later on Newton and Laplace, and then so many others, and I don't want to go into the details of this. I think most people are quite familiar with it. And then finally the revolution in biology, which is basically evolution and heredity in the mid-19th century, almost within a decade of each other. Next slide, please. So to come first to the rediscovery of Aristotelian philosophy and natural sciences. Now what this meant for the intellectuals at that time, who in Europe were mostly theologians, is that this confronted them with a body of thought and a bunch of intellectual techniques of how to think, how to construct arguments, how to construct proofs, which was very, very different from what they had. They had basically the scripture, and that was their sole source of knowledge and wisdom. And this was very imposing. Many people were impressed by this extremely elaborate body of thought and rules for thought that the Greeks had come up with, and this was completely independent of scripture. What happened as a consequence of this was that many thinkers at that time began to try to integrate this way of thinking into how they approached their theology. And this could be a sort of a talk in itself, but one little example that is quite interesting I give here from Thomas Aquinas, where he tried to develop a sort of logical proof for the existence of God. In fact, Thomas Aquinas did a lot to try to make theology more logical and more Aristotelian. And so he said, there's this fivefold proof. There must be a first mover unmoved itself, a first cause in the chain of causes. See, this is an interesting thing which will become relevant when we come to the next upheaval. An absolutely necessary being, an absolutely perfect being, and a rational designer. And this I will return back to the rational designer when we come to the third revolution. Next slide, please. Now in the physical sciences, the revolution that took place, first of all, removed the earth from the center of the universe, and in some sense took away the uniqueness of the earth. The earth became one more heavenly body amongst many others that followed similar rules to those followed by other heavenly bodies. So the uniqueness of the earth that we inhabit was gone. It also established modes of thinking and verifying one's thoughts through experimentation that led to a view that physical phenomena were governed by laws of cause and effect, thus leaving no requirement for a supernatural deity as an explanation of physical phenomena. So essentially the necessity to invoke God to explain physical phenomena was gone. I mean, people who wanted to invoke God could still do so, but the necessity to do so was pretty much gone. The mystery to some extent was removed from physical phenomena, including the movements of celestial bodies. And also the whole sort of system of thinking that we today call science, of hypothesis experimentation, also sort of began to crystallize during this period. However, dominant intelligentsia are usually very good at consolidating against any upheaval and somehow subverting that upheaval into their own body of thought, and this happens outside of science too all the time. And essentially what happened was that theological thought, at least as followed by certain thinkers, took a turn towards what has often been called deism and sometimes rational Christianity, and this view really was, next slide please, that God has created the world and has given the world these simple laws according to which the physical world operates. And God has also then created the living creatures on the world, and in this view what happened was, in some sense, the physical world was a standalone creation, or viewed as a standalone creation, that God created it and He's given the rules, and now the world basically works. It doesn't require His direct intervention at all. But in this view, what happened was that the importance of God as an explanatory feature, as an explanation for observed phenomena, shrunk into the realm of biology, because that was now the only remaining area. Next slide please. Okay, this is a somewhat longish quote from Burroughs' Introduction to the Origin of Species, but he puts this really very well. Thus, in the early 19th century, there were still areas where God seemed an indispensable hypothesis, not merely as the remote architect and president of the solar system, but as a familiar and infinitely ingenious craftsman and benevolent providing father of whom it did not seem inconceivable that he marked the sparrow's fall. For if the God who maintained the orderly revolutions of the planets by the invisible filaments of gravitation was remote and impersonal, the designer of the butterfly's wing, the rational designer, I remind you, the designer of the butterfly's wing surely cared for human delight, just as the existence of materials for human food and shelter testified to a divine concern for human comfort and well-being. Physics and chemistry may be able to dispense with the concept of purpose in explaining the behavior of phenomena. Biology could hardly do so, for evidence of purpose seemed irrefutable in all the ingenious contrivances, the exquisite adaptations of structure to function so apparent in nature. Religion seemed guaranteed by natural theology. And this really sums up what happened in terms of God remaining an explanatory concept in terms of explaining the living world. And I will come back to exactly in what sense God was invoked to explain this, what were the features of the living world that God was invoked to explain in a little bit. There is one more aspect that I want to touch on, and this again goes back to Aristotle, actually to Aristotle's teacher Plato. And this is Plato's notion of the essences or eidos that underlie the surface appearance of things. And Plato maintained that these essences were actually far more important, and in some sense they were the real reality, not the outward manifestation of the essence which we actually observe. And Aristotle applied this idealist thinking to biology. And in Aristotle's view, the variations among individuals of a species became therefore unimportant, because the species represented an underlying idea, an underlying essence, and accidents of nature, of upbringing, etc., of growing up, caused variations which were basically mere distracting noise. And so this idea was there that species represented underlying essences. And he further actually developed a theory of heredity and postulated that it was actually the species essence which was transmitted from parents to offspring. And this is a very interesting idea, because if the species essence is immutable and constant across individuals, the same across all individuals of that species, the essence after all, and that is what is transmitted to offspring, then this is a view of heredity that does not allow for any variation. And this is an important point to note. And in general, what variation you would see normally in the living world becomes just distracting noise in this view. Yet, if you look at any biological system, variation is practically a defining characteristic of living systems. At whatever level of organization you look, you see variation. And this thinking, given the importance of Aristotle over European thought, remained in biology, and even today you have the concept of the archetype in taxonomy, which we all come across in school. That is the remnant of idealistic thinking. Certainly it has some practical value. You come across such idealistic thinking even now in biology textbooks all the time, especially in school text. It really hasn't gone away from the school text, at least not in this country. Next slide please. And this Platonic essences actually fit in very well with natural theology, and I again quote from Michael Rose in Darwin's Spectre. This conception also fit well with the theology of Western Christendom after the Renaissance. If God is conceived as an all-powerful being capable of the most perfect creations, then the species that he creates should reflect his original intentions in their underlying natures. Essences and supreme beings go together quite nicely, lending an elevated tone to biology, which after the Renaissance fashioned itself part of natural theology. Next slide, please. Okay. So this third intellectual upheaval was the revolution in biology, or the notion of adaptive evolution by natural selection. And what this did is interesting to contrast with the earlier upheaval. The earlier upheaval had sort of dethroned the earth from its very important and unique position. This idea actually dethroned humans from the center of the living world and stripped us of the uniqueness among living beings that we had given ourselves, at least in Christian theology. In many other theologies, human beings have not really been conceived of as being so unique, and the idea of evolution does not pose similar challenges to all theologies. It eliminated the requirement for a supernatural deity, not only from the physical world, but now even as an explanation of pattern and process in the biological realm. So this last realm where God had to be invoked as an explanation, even there it was now shown that there was no requirement to have to invoke God if one wanted to understand the attributes of the living world. And this last point is a little bit narrower than the first two. It focused attention on variation as an important reality in its own right in biological systems, as opposed to focusing on abstract underlying essences. And this is what Ernst Mayr has referred to very often as the shift from typological to populational thinking. And as I said, I don't think this shift has really permeated all of biology yet. In this particular case of this third upheaval in the mid-19th century, the religious Christian intelligentsia is still trying to come to grips with this. They haven't found a way to sidestep it quite as conveniently as they did for the first two upheavals. And okay, this sums up in some sense what we are saying about the nature of this third revolution. This is a quote again from Michael Rose. In total, Darwin provided a foundation for biology which was completely free of religious elements. For molecular biologists, this contribution is very much in the background. They can just go on with experiments whose rationale derives more from principles of organic chemistry than evolutionary biology. But the fact that they do not need to bow toward Rome or Canterbury by way of scientific piety is largely the result of Darwin's achievement. And away from those biological fields where straightforward molecular analysis is enough to unravel all problems, the evolutionary reasoning first provided by Darwin is often the central means of intellectual analysis, defining problems, suggesting alternative solutions, and deciding among competing hypotheses. Modern biology would be inconceivable without Darwinian theories and findings. Now here I would like to digress before the talk shifts to a little more detailed discussion of the role of evolution in biology. Evolution, as I mentioned in the beginning, has had many social and political ramifications. And the kinds of attacks that have been made on evolution earlier on and are continuing are of two kinds. One is in some sense a religious attack saying that evolutionary biology is undermining religion. This in itself is a somewhat is an attack which is somewhat difficult to refute because it's very illogical. In the first place, it's not undermining religion, it's undermining certain theologies. And in the second place, it is very easy to actually reconcile evolution even with those theologies if people were a little creative and gave a little bit more metaphorical interpretation to certain writings. It's actually not that difficult, and certain theologians in Europe and the United States have actually made attempts to argue for a more metaphorical interpretation of the book of Genesis, which is really the major source of discord with evolutionary biology. The other argument, which is sort of a corollary of this but has now been picked up even by non-theological groups and sort of left of center political groups, is that evolutionary biology somehow destroys the foundations of ethics and ethical society. Now this is to my mind at least, a very interesting criticism. Because this raises a couple of questions. The first question this raises to my mind is that there seems to be a presupposition, at least in some versions of this criticism, that you cannot have ethics without religion. And that, I think, is a very interesting and arguable notion in its own right, whether one can have ethics without religion or not. And I personally think that we can, but that's really a whole debate in itself. The other thing is that if we say that, okay, evolutionary biology, and this is another side of this criticism, is that, well, this has nothing to do with religion, but evolutionary biology somehow destroys the ethical foundations of human society because it exalts the struggle for existence. It preaches the idea that might is right, and so on. And you can find this criticism in writings and speeches by people all over, at least the United States and a few other countries. Now this I find also a somewhat fascinating criticism, because this presupposes the fact that we should be organizing our society and our social life based to how other species and the living world at large functions. Now, as a proposition, I think that is remarkably stupid. Why should the organization of our society depend upon how natural selection works? I don't see any logical necessity for society to be organized along such rules. However, these criticisms remain quite popular, and the interesting thing about evolution is that it is criticized by all kinds of people across the entire spectrum of political and social views. It is criticized from the right, it is criticized from the left. I have had devout Christian friends of mine telling me that evolution was inspired by Satan to destroy Christianity. I have had an equally devout Pakistani friend who once explained to me in great detail that evolution was Christianity's way of destroying Islam. Now, any theory which is getting invoked on all sides of the political spectrum, I think, to me suggests that actually none of this has anything to do with the basic ideas or the basic theory. It's being used as a sort of a tool in various political agendas, in much the same way that religion is often used as a tool in various political agendas. So that is pretty much what I wanted to say about the historical development of evolution up to the point that this revolution took place. And now I want to focus in the remaining time a little bit more about the importance of evolution to biology per se. Now this biological revolution, or the idea of evolution excuse me, I am not referring just to Darwin's work. I am actually referring to a body of thought that has many different elements and that has been getting refined over the last 150 years or so. There is, of course, the idea that various living forms are related via descent, the idea of evolution itself through modification from common ancestors, the idea that natural selection is a major force. So this, in some sense, is where Darwin's contribution was. And then there is, of course, very important the particulate nature of inheritance, which is really Mendel's contribution. And then the welding together of these three into the neo-Darwinian synthesis, and some much more recent welding togethers of different fields that I think have just begun to happen, which are very important. Next slide, please. So, if you look at the living world, there are a few things which are very striking. One is the diversity of species, just the sheer diversity of form, of behavior, of ecology, of structure, of function. Yet, this diversity of species is not just a random diversity. There are patterns of relatedness in the sense of patterns of similarity between species. You can group species based on degree of similarity into hierarchical groups. And then there is the adaptedness of species. Many species appear to be extremely well tuned to the lifestyle they have, to the environments they inhabit, and so on. And then, of course, there is the ubiquity of variation. Next slide, please. This is an example of the relatedness of species. You have up here a diversity of body forms, from sponges to four-legged terrestrial vertebrates. And the point is that based on various criteria, you can group these into more and more inclusive groups based on degrees of similarity. And the closer the grouping is here, the more the similarity. So in fact, The reason we can have a taxonomy at all or a system of classification at all is because of this pattern of relatedness among species. Next slide, please. This is another interesting thing that was recognized a couple of 100 years ago in Europe when people started studying embryonic development, and that is that if you look at these different vertebrates from fish ranging up to humans and other mammals, the early stages of the embryos are exceedingly similar, and even the mammalian embryos have gill slits and a tail. Later stages, the embryos become quite a bit different. Now this is again an interesting thing. This was known by the time that Darwin was doing his thinking, and it is interesting to ponder why, if some supernatural being had created all this, what was the necessity to do it this way? Why couldn't mammalian embryos be distinct right from the beginning? It's an interesting puzzle. Why should they sort of go through very similar stages early in development and later on differentiate later on? Next slide, please. This is another example of vertebrate limbs that actually serve fairly different functions, from swimming at this end, and this is a reptile and a mammal, both adapted to swimming, a mammal and a bird adapted to flying, and two different mammals. This is for walking, and this is really for grasping and manipulating objects with a human hand, human arm. And again, the various bones in here through development can be found to be homologous. They arise in the same way from the same parts of the embryo they are laid down, but then they grow into very different structures. And in some cases, the way in which these structures are created is not necessarily the way that an engineer would have created them if he was starting from scratch. They are very strange jury-rigged structures in many cases. And once again, if every species was to be created anew, why these very odd and in some cases not very well manufactured structures? Why not perfect marvels of optimal creation? Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide sort of summarizes some of the important historical events in biology. If we have time going down this way, and this thick arrow is also supposed to represent some kind of a separation. In the 18th century, the idea of descent with modification was already in the air. Darwin's ancestor Erasmus Darwin had talked about it. Buffon in France had talked quite a lot about it. On the other side, there were studies going on. These hybridization studies are basically attempts by people to understand the nature of heredity. And so people were trying to cross different varieties and try to study the offspring and figure out how heredity worked. And then there were also people interested in studying embryonic development, and there was a big debate at this point between the preformationists and the epigeneticists. And the preformationists basically said that the development of a grown animal from a simple fertilized egg could be nothing more than an unfolding of structures that are already there in minuscule form. And so basically structures are just getting bigger, but the whole body is already there preformed inside the egg. And fertilization somehow causes the structures to become bigger and maybe get modified a little bit, but the structures are really all there. The epigeneticists, on the other hand, said, well, if you look at a fertilized egg, you don't see anything in there. It's a formless, relatively formless mass, which is probably all they saw with their microscopes at that time. And you cannot have structures coming out of a formless nothing. So there has to be some vital force, and so the epigeneticists here were really also the vitalists. Into the 19th century, the idea of descent with modification, that species were not all created but had evolved from one another, this was very strongly put forward by Lamarck. And in fact, Lamarck's role is not often appreciated enough, because he was a very, very eminent biologist of his time, and he really made the notion that evolution had occurred part of mainstream biology discussion. And he also had provided a mechanism for it, which we today know to be more or less not applicable to most situations. Also, Saint-Hilaire talked a lot about descent with modification. So the idea of evolution was very much there even in the early 19th century. Some notions of selection were also beginning to creep into people's writings, although most people did not really develop the idea of selection in much detail. But it's interesting, Darwin in the foreword of Origin of Species actually spends about 20 pages discussing all the people from Aristotle onwards who have somehow stumbled upon the notion of selection even if they didn't follow it up entirely. And then of course you have the putting together of the notion of selection and the descent with modification into a theory of adaptive evolution by natural selection. And here this debate of preformationists and epigeneticists pretty much continued. Hybridization studies pretty much continued, and finally in Mendel's work led to a notion of particulate inheritance in the mid 19th century. The other thing that got started around the mid 19th century were statistical studies of inheritance, largely the inheritance of human traits by Francis Galton, and he really took up on traits very different from the kinds of traits that Mendel dealt with. Mendel dealt with discrete traits, Galton was dealing with traits you could measure on a metric scale. And in the process he began to develop many tools which later on blossomed into the discipline of statistics. Now, this is one of the interesting ironies of the history of biology, is that this whole theory of adaptive evolution by natural selection required variation to act on. And of course Darwin argued that variation was always there. If you looked at the natural world you saw variation. But Darwin had no idea about how this variation could be maintained, because one of the dominant views about inheritance at that time was a blending inheritance which tends to wipe out variation over a few generations. And what this theory of evolution by natural selection was really missing was a mechanism of discrete or particulate inheritance. And that was around the same time developed by Mendel, but Mendel's work remained largely unknown to most of the biological community for another 50 years. And it is said that when Darwin died, that on his desk was a letter from one of his European friends who had sent him a copy of Mendel's paper. And this was an unopened letter found on Darwin's desk when he died. And people have really speculated about what if Darwin had actually read Mendel's paper, would he have seen that Mendel's work solved his whole problem of variation? So anyway, around the beginning of the 1900s, Mendel's work was rediscovered independently by several people, and immediately many people saw that inheritance, now that we understood the mechanisms of inheritance, one could think about evolution. And immediately there was a big rift between a group called the Mendelians and a group called the biometricians, and this is in the first decade or first 2 decades roughly of the 20th century. The Mendelians, championed by Bateson, the first person to occupy a chair in genetics in the world, argued that since inheritance was particulate, but Darwin had always been talking about these variations that were very gradual. Darwin had been talking largely about metric traits most of the time, not striking things like red versus yellow flowers or green versus yellow seeds. So Bateson and others began to argue that if inheritance was actually particulate, then Darwin's theory of evolution through gradual accumulation of change in continuous variants probably was not a good explanation of evolution. So in fact, ironically, the people who played a major role in bringing Mendel's ideas to full fruition and light immediately rejected Darwin's view of evolution in favor of a very different view of evolution based on rapid appearance of individuals that were very different from pre-existing individuals due to change in some gene or the other, and then some kind of evolution based on mutation and so on. At the same time, the biometricians did almost the exact mirror image of this. They argued that since evolution in the Darwinian sense was based upon continuous variations, and to them the notion of adaptive evolution by natural selection made total sense, plus their intellectual lineage was coming from statistical studies of continuous variation, they basically argued that Mendel's laws were irrelevant to most traits. they applied only to some subset of small discrete traits which were completely unimportant to most important things like evolution. And so they basically said, we have to continue searching for proper laws of inheritance that apply to continuous variation. Mendel's laws are not going to take us anywhere. And this debate raged, partly fueled by the personalities of Bateson and Pearson, both of whom were very combative and competitive people. This raged for 18 years before Ronald Fisher, in a paper published in 1918, showed that in fact one could reconcile the statistical view of continuous trait inheritance with particulate inheritance with adaptive evolution and put it all together, and this is really what has sometimes been called the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, or this is the beginning of the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, when Fisher, Sewell Wright, J.B.S. Haldane and Chetverikov in the Soviet Union put together the idea of natural selection, adaptive evolution, Mendelian inheritance, quantitative inheritance in terms of the inheritance of continuous traits, put it all together into a very coherent and elaborate theory. And this is really the foundation of evolutionary theory, is the mathematical theory of evolutionary genetics. And there have been minor elaborations to this over the last 80 years or so, but nothing much which is as shattering as this was when it happened. And what I really think is now happening is that ecology, which really traces its roots back to sort of observational natural history, delighting in the joys of nature and all that, and natural theology of course meant that while delighting in the joys of nature you were simultaneously exalting the glory of God. So it was all the more important to do that. And this natural history gradually had become quite a bit more sophisticated, and I am not going to trace the development of ecology here, but for most part, strangely enough, ecology developed completely separate from evolutionary biology, especially in the post-Darwin era. Darwin was in some sense an ecologist par excellence. But after Darwin, ecology went its own way, evolution went its own way, and after the 1900s, evolution got more and more into genetics and influenced by genetics. And the bringing back together of ecology and evolution has only begun to happen in maybe the last 25 years or so. And this is a very important unification going on, and now even more nascent is the reunification of developmental biology and evolution, which I think is extremely important. This is just beginning, and this is probably going to lead to a great refinement in our understanding. How much more time do I have? Fine, okay. Next please.
We started a little late.
Okay, you can skip this. Next please. Okay. What I would like to do here is to argue about what I was saying earlier about evolution today really being biology. This is a view of, okay, below this dotted line I am representing the genotype, and then the phenotype, which is actually the observable characteristics of an organism which we can see or measure. The genotype is the genetic endowment of the organism. And then above this I am representing the environment, and the environment consists of both the biotic or the living environment and the abiotic or the physical environment. Now the middle part here and these blue arrows are really representing what goes on within the lifetime of a single organism. A genotype, which is located in the fertilized egg in most sexually reproducing species, essentially gives rise to a phenotype. It gives rise to the organism as we see it and as we can measure it. However, the phenotype at various stages in this development from the genotype of the organism does feed back upon this process, and the environment does also affect this process. The phenotype in turn, once it is formed, once development is complete, the adult phenotype can also be affected by the environment in many ways. And there are very interesting phenomena here such as adaptive plasticity and so on. And the phenotype in many cases can affect the environment, and I think humans are a very good example of how the phenotype can affect the environment. We completely alter our environment. Now, if we think about what happens in the course of evolution, the phenotype has to now exist, or the organism that has its phenotype has to exist in this environment, make a living and reproduce. And its ability to do so is going to be based upon how well its attributes or its phenotype are suited to making a living in that particular environment or to getting along in that particular environment. So this interaction between the phenotype and the environment, this is really what constitutes natural selection. Because as a result of this, what is happening is that certain individuals that have certain characteristics, certain phenotypes, are better able to survive and reproduce in that particular environment. So selection acts on the phenotypes. Selection sees only the phenotype, not the genotype. But as a result of selection acting on the phenotype, it is the genotypes that actually get selected. And this is somewhat subtle but very important point, which is often glossed over. Because the phenotype has been created by the genotype, and the phenotype, the body of the organism, is not the one that is going to get passed on to the next generation. It is the underlying genes that, because of the body they produced, are getting a better chance to make copies of themselves and pass them on. But the genotype gets selected, but the genotype is not what is transmitted to the offspring, because what is transmitted are haploid genomes, not diploid genomes. What gets transmitted to offspring differentially as a result of selection acting on the phenotypes are actually individual genes, not genotypes. And this again has important consequences. This is a distinction that is often not made too clearly, but it has very important consequences. Now, the genotype of an organism, its total genetic endowment, is a very integrated whole. The genome is a very integrated thing. It's not many genes existing in a vacuum and functioning in a vacuum. So this genotype itself can sort of feed back on how well it reproduces itself. And this itself can feed back on here and affect the rate at which this reproduction is going on. And here is basically the cycle of genetics. Meiosis to go from diploid genotype to haploid gametes carrying genes, and fertilization to restore the diploid genotype. Now in this whole scheme of things, in my opinion and in my view, this whole thing is the domain of evolution. This is the evolutionary process, because evolution is intimately associated with what happens at the individual level, because that's how the phenotype is produced. And then it is concerned with what happens at the populational level in terms of selection acting on the array of phenotypes produced. And very often what happens, if you think about things like population genetics, we usually just bother about this part of the picture here. This rest is ignored, and we say, well, if the force of natural selection is such, how will this loop look like? That's basically the domain of population genetics. This arrow here is really developmental biology. And gene transcription, which occupies in many people's minds an entirely unwarranted importance, is a small blip at the beginning of this arrow. So in this view of evolution, as I said, I think what happens here is extremely important, the development part, because another level of complexity here is that the matching or the mapping of genotype to phenotype is many to many, it's not one to one. If the mapping from genotype to phenotype was one to one, then many of our simplistic ways of looking at evolution entirely through looking at phenotypes, etc., which is very popular in evolutionary ecology, would all work quite well. But the fact that this mapping is many to many actually makes it much more tricky to be very confident about models that work with just the phenotype and selection and ignore the genetics. And indeed, it is equally meaningless to consider models which ignore the ecology, which is all that is happening up on this interface here. So really, one needs to take into account the ecology here, development here, and the underlying genetics here to really understand evolution and thereby to understand life itself. Next, please. Actually, just go on. I'll keep going. I think there's not much time left. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Okay. So in conclusion, One of the beauties of evolution, and this has been expressed very, very nicely by Stephen Jay Gould, and when he says that evolution encompasses both the particulars that fascinate and the generalities that instruct. And the generalities in some sense come on the genetic side of evolutionary theory, and the particulars come from the gory details of development and ecology. Another place he has said that the great duality of evolutionary biology as a discipline is richness in particularities and potential union in underlying explanation. And this view, I would just like to leave you at the end, has been very nicely put by Charles Darwin himself. This is the concluding paragraph of The Origin of Species. And Darwin says, "It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, have all been produced by laws acting around us. These laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction, inheritance, variability from the indirect and direct action of the external conditions of life." This is where Darwin got it all wrong, his idea of inheritance. "A ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows." Next slide, please. And he goes on, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." Thank you very much. Certainly.
For a non-biologist, I've had a strong background in biology, and yet my exposure to evolution has pretty much just been